democracies, you have to convince your citizens to cast such a vote and not a different one. So we need that pedagogy is key, education is key in that sense for us to exercise our responsibilities, our rights, and our political duties. Being able to interpret and figure out what is fake news and what is not, to be able to spot lies, and to be able to interpret which are the truths or which are the symbolic frameworks that are being developed by big platforms and those TNCs, those companies that use our data for commercial purposes. They use our private life, our privacy, and how this sets up what can be seen and what cannot be seen, what can be said and cannot be said. So we have a new line between what's sensitive and what's not, as Rancière would say, a philosopher who discussed this line between aesthetics and politics. And in that sense, we want to know, and I think it's very important to be able to interpret what is today defining our cognitive frameworks, apart from the consequences themselves that I'm sure all of us here today have experienced firsthand. We're constantly paying attention to the notifications of our phone, or Twitter likes, or Twitter posts, or likes on Facebook. This is a new thing, and of course our digital subjectivity and our digital narcissism changes too. So it's a historical moment in which technology is playing quite a role in the setting up of our social and political framework. I don't want to look like a techno pessimist. It's true that social media have given us the possibility to organize ourselves and relate among ourselves beyond hegemonical political frameworks. And it's true that they have opened up spaces to cross-cutting horizontal political configurations, for example, the 15M, Occupy, or the Arab Spring, to name a few. So the potential that social media have when it comes to organizing political activism on digital networks is huge. But of course, on the other hand, we have these dangers and these impositions that are set upon us from the digital framework, which is the framework that we're living with today. Okay, let me leave it at that, because Anastasia, Kavada, and Simona Levi will share much more with you. Let me introduce them briefly. Anastasia Kavada is a politics and communication professor at the Westminster University. She's the co-director of the Masters in Media Campaigning and Social Change. She's one of the directors of an interdisciplinary community, a collaborative community on arts, communication, and cultural research. And her research focuses precisely on the coordination of digital media, social movements, and democratic participation for political transformation.
I també tenim a la Simona Levi.
And we have also with us Simona Levi. Good evening, Simona. Thank you very much for being here. We are very happy to have Simona with us. Simona is a person who has been the digital activist in Barcelona. She is very versatile, very committed to. She's a playwright, a theater director, strategist, politician, cultural manager, interdisciplinary researcher, reporter, professor. And above all, she's a great activist from European social movements in terms of the free movement of knowledge, culture, and information, and regarding the promotion of digital democracy, the strategic use of digital tools for the organization and collective action, and above all, the fight against corruption. You might probably remember XNet, the digital platform that proposes alternative cultural dissemination models, and also the 15M Parrato movement. That was the movement that back in 2012 filed a lawsuit against Rodrigo Rato, the former manager of Bankia, and that resulted in the Bankia trial. She is directing Technopolitics MA in Pompeu Fabra University, and she has widely published, for example, To Vote and To Earn, published by Capital Swing, Free Digital Culture by Icaria, publishing house Technopolitics, Internet and Revolutions on the Centrality of Social Media in the 15M, published by Icaria. And she is the co-author of Fake You, that has been published by Ratchbert. I'm mentioning all her books because this is bibliography that can support us in this education and training that we need and that we propose for today. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Simona to introduce, we hand over to Anastasia, and then we will hold a dialogue and we will give the floor to the audience for questions. Thank you very much and see you now.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? This is Anastasia. Hello, it's really nice to be here, and many thanks for the invitation to Paula Kuffer, to Alborn for coordinating this great event. I really look forward to discussing this with you and also with the amazing Simona. But let me share, I do have a PowerPoint presentation for you because I thought this would make things easier and you won't see me looming over you in this big screen for those of you who are actually at the venue. So let me share this presentation with you. Just a moment. Okay, so what I wanted to do in this first 20 or 25 minutes of this event is I'd like to set the stage for our discussion by outlining how social media pedagogies relate to democracy. So as I will try to show, how we think of social media pedagogies differs depending on the kinds of social media we have in mind, whether we're talking about the mainstream platforms like Facebook or Twitter, or whether we are taking a more expansive view that includes a wider range of alternative digital media platforms. And I think it also varies depending on the kinds of democracy that we have in mind, as well as the kinds of pedagogies that we prefer to follow. So let me try to unpack this a little bit in these first 20 minutes. I'll start with the mainstream debates on the issue. In the past few years, discussions about the role of social media in democracies have been dominated by a concern with disinformation. As the report on disinformation and fake news by the UK House of Commons put it, we have always experienced propaganda and politically aligned bias, which purports to be news. But this activity has taken on new forms and has been hugely magnified by information technology and the ubiquity of social media. In this environment, people are able to accept and give credence to information that reinforces their views, no matter how distorted or inaccurate, while dismissing content with which they do not agree as fake news. This has led to concerns about the connection between social media and a rise in authoritarianism, as leaders with a more authoritarian bent can use social media to sow confusion and to discredit political opponents. Scenes like this in the USA, one of the bastions of liberal representative democracy, have fueled this concern. While the 2020 elections were won by the Democrats, former President Donald Trump used social media to insist that the election was stolen, even though all of his efforts to prove this through the courts were unsuccessful. This led to an insurrection on the 6th of January 2021, when Trump supporters stormed the Capitol, attempting to stop the certification of election results that was happening at the time. And we saw scenes like these, as you see in this photograph here. So why do we think that mainstream social media, like Facebook and Twitter, facilitate disinformation? Firstly, it's because their business model is fueled by likes and clicks, which offer rich data for tracking interactions. And since fake news increase click-through rates, social media platforms actually benefit from them. News that stir people's emotions circulate more widely. And it doesn't really matter whether fake news stories are then refuted, because the posts that debunk fake news are not shared as widely as the fake news themselves. The algorithm of social media also creates what we call filter bubbles. It prioritizes posts by social media accounts that we have liked and interacted with in the past. So the algorithm tends to show us news and opinions that we already agree with. This can increase polarization and make extreme ideas seem accepted or acceptable. The algorithm of social media is also a black box, as it is protected by competition law. So it is very difficult to have transparency and accountability on these issues. The distortion of information on social media platforms is exacerbated by bots and what we now call computational propaganda. Bots are automated scripts that produce content and interact with social media accounts. They pretend to be real people, so they make it difficult to tell real from false. It is sometimes impossible to tell how many retweets, for example, have been generated by such automated accounts. There is also an inequality here, as it is the better resourced political campaigns and actors that can invest money in computational propaganda techniques. For instance, according to research by Howard and Polanyi, political bots had a small but strategic role in discussions around the UK Brexit referendum. Furthermore, the data that is amassed by social media platforms is then combined with other data sources from consumption practices, for instance, in order to construct detailed psychographic profiles of users. Cambridge Analytica was one such company specializing in this, and although it is no longer active after the big scandal, there are many others who still do this job. These detailed psychographic profiles then help political campaigns do micro-targeting of their political ads and tailor them to the particular concerns and characteristics of specific users. This makes political advertising very difficult to track, as different people receive different messages. Such political ads are also not widely accessible or publicly archived. While Twitter has banned political ads, which you could say is a good move, Facebook is still running them and not fact-checking them, an issue that has landed Facebook in a lot of heat during the latest presidential elections in the US, for instance. And at least in the UK, the rules governing the reporting of a political campaign's spending on advertising makes it very difficult to judge who has paid for political ads on social media, and this further limits transparency and accountability. So this is why mainstream social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter have been associated with disinformation. It is a perfect storm of algorithms, irresponsible use of data, a business model based on ads, clicks, and likes, as well as gaps in regulation. There is one additional problem when it comes to fact-checking, as social media companies claim that since they are not producing the news that circulate on their platforms, they shouldn't be held to account if it is inaccurate. However, new regulations that are introduced in different countries aim to change this situation. In the UK, the Online Harms Bill will place social media platforms under the regulation of Ofcom. The regulator will be able to impose fines of up to £18 million, or 10% of global turnover, for publishing information that is deemed as harmful. In Germany, the Network Enforcement Act became law in January 2018. 10 companies have up to 24 hours to remove hate speech from their sites, or they face fines of up to €20 million. This is probably why many of Facebook's moderators now work in Germany. In France as well, a new law passed in November 2018 can lead to the removal of articles promoting disinformation during election campaigns, while those who violate the law can spend a year in prison and face a fine of €75,000. Now, what these laws signify is a move away from the notion that since social media are not content creators, they shouldn't be held to account for the content that is shared by users on these platforms. But certain questions also arise. Firstly, it still remains to be seen whether and to what extent countries have the capacity to monitor social media companies and implement the law. It may also be easier for the larger and more well-resourced social media companies to follow the rules set out in these laws, because, for instance, they can spend more on hiring moderators. So these rules may actually strengthen the monopoly of the large social networking companies and place smaller companies and alternative platforms in a weaker position. And there are also questions around freedom of speech and whether and to what extent these regulations open the door to censorship, as they could be used to silence voices that are critical of the government, for instance. Of course, the other solution that has been proposed is increasing media literacy so citizens are aware of disinformation. Such initiatives focus on training people to exercise critical thinking when dealing with online information. For example, the Council of Europe has recommended that schools implement such training programs for their students. We see similar initiative also for news production professionals. For instance, UNESCO has published a handbook on fake news and disinformation targeted at journalists. And another example, this time tailored more to civil society practitioners, the Program on Democracy and Technology of the Oxford Internet Institute has launched the DemTech Navigator, which informs civil society groups about computational propaganda and disinformation. But now let's zoom out a little bit, right? And let's try to investigate a little bit the logic that underlines all of these discussions. Now, first of all, the focus of these debates is on mainstream social media platforms like Facebook or Twitter. Such discussions are also dominated by a view of democracy that is based on the liberal representative system. In this system, the main duty of citizens is to be properly informed so as to vote in elections in a rational manner and in a way that accords to their individual interests. Citizens are often thought as consumers of politics and of political information. Therefore, social media pedagogies with regards to disinformation tend to be rather top-down, where experts teach students, journalists, or civil society groups how to counter disinformation. And most discussions around disinformation and democracy focus on how disinformation harms democracy, but very little on the opposite effect, on how it is specific problems of the liberal democratic system that have given rise to social media disinformation in the first place. In fact, the crisis of representative democracy in Europe and in the USA has been documented for a very long time. People feel distanced from politics. They distrust the mainstream media, and they believe that politicians are corrupt and do not serve the interests of the people. In a situation where you feel that you are constantly being lied to by the powers that be, whether it is politicians or the mainstream media, the truth becomes so relative that it's no longer relevant, that it no longer matters. What matters is belief. This is what post-truth politics is based on. Whilst truth is founded on the classic Enlightenment belief, I think, therefore I am, the famous phrase by René Descartes, post-truth is not based on rationality, but on belief. I believe, therefore I'm right. Fake news has been weaponized by the same people who are thought to be using mainstream media platforms to peddle false news. Donald Trump has been calling the mainstream media fake news media for a while now. This means that by focusing the discussion on the mainstream social media platforms, which certainly have a great responsibility for this situation, don't get me wrong, I think that we still tend to forget the broader political context and the crisis of representative democracy that gave rise to this phenomenon. And in fact, we've known about these problems for a very long time, right? So we are now very close. We're approaching the 10th anniversary of the 15M movement, or the Indignados, where people flooded the streets and squares in Spain to demand real democracy, not the one practiced by politicians and bankers. Greece soon followed, with crowds gathering in Syntagma Square in Athens in the end of May 2011, and in other cities around Greece. And in September 2011, we had Occupy Wall Street flooding Zuccotti Park in New York and railing against the excesses of Wall Street and its role in the economic crisis, and also it demanded more democracy. The last such movement to arise was in March 2016 in France. You see here people gathering in Place de la République in Paris. The protest started as a reaction against a new labor law that was being introduced at the time, which would lower protections for workers. But soon protesters started gathering in the squares, talking about the system of democracy in the country and forming working groups around different issues, including racism, poverty, health, or the environment. The movements of the squares, as we now call them, strove to imagine and practice a different type of democracy, one that attempted to escape the flaws of the liberal representative system. Whether they succeeded or not is a different issue, and for those of us and those of you who have taken part in these movements, I'm sure that there are many criticisms, right? But I think that they still provided us with an alternative vision of democracy and a set of democratic values whose echoes can be heard in current movements such as Black Lives Matter and the environmental movement, with organizations such as Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion. And if you're interested around the values of these more current movements and how they match the movements of the squares, I have actually written something about this very recently. But okay, what are these key democratic values of the movements of the squares? So firstly, these movements centered around action. They offered a framework that empowered participants to embark on projects they were interested in, from creating an alternative social media platform, to changing the state's economic policy, to keeping the movement's kitchens going. They thus fostered a kind of project democracy, as I like to call it, allowing people to become involved according to their skills and interests, as well as to develop their creative capacities and to learn by doing. Citizens here are not thought as political consumers, right? But as producers of politics and of the commons. They are not simply participants in the decision-making process, but take an active part in the collective. The movements of the squares were also based on an absolute belief in equality. Not the narrow equality of liberal representative democracy, which tends to think of equality as one person, one vote, right? But in an expansive way that refers to the equality of power in determining the outcome of decisions. So this is linked to a more intersectional understanding of power, one that considers how patriarchy, colonialism, racism, ableism, and the class system severely limit the capacity of citizens to be treated as equals within the democratic system. The movements of the squares attempted to guarantee equality through inclusive systems of decision-making and the avoidance of central leadership, stressing instead the movement's leaderfulness, where multiple people could play leadership roles. Finally, I think that the squares movements attempted to guarantee economic equality by managing their resources in ways that adhere to the values of the commons. This point to collective forms of ownership. So the commons pose an alternative to capitalist relations of productions. They allow every movement participant to contribute to and benefit from the movement's resources. In the last couple of decades, this growing emphasis on the commons also stems from the increasing influence of free software and free culture movements, whose activists were also involved in the movements of the squares. And I think that this was much more pronounced also in Barcelona, where you have a very, very strong free culture movement. These movements were also based on an ethic of care, a recognition that caring for the needs of the civic body, both physical and emotional, is an inherent part of democracy. They thus developed infrastructures for living that included kitchens, sanitation facilities, and even gardens, like taking actually care of the physical needs of the people. But also their decision-making processes placed empathy and solidarity at the center, helping lay citizens to share their experiences and personal stories, but also their emotions. It was not only about opinions, but also about sharing your emotions and your personal experience with others. But the value of care also extended to all living beings, human and non-human, a radical notion of care that we also currently see in the environmental movement. This emphasis on care is a move away from the rather individualistic understanding of the citizen in the liberal model, and a response to the ravaging of social welfare system after the economic crisis of 2008. And I think that care is also becoming a very, very central value right now in a time of pandemic. So, You will be asking yourself, so what does this mean for social media pedagogies? What does this tell us? I think that firstly, it denotes that the citizen uses social media and digital media in general as an active participant and producer of information, of politics, of action. This encompasses a much wider range of digital media skills that includes, for instance, the use of digital media for decision-making, for campaigning, for producing and disseminating information. So people are not just political consumers of information, but use digital media for a wider range of activities. To give you an example, in the UK, we had about 3,500 local groups being set up in 2020 for neighbors to help each other during the pandemic. This was completely bottom-up. Yes? This was completely bottom-up and self-organized. Volunteers would pick up shopping and prescriptions and walk the dogs of those self-isolating. They would also make friendly phone calls to limit the impact of the pandemic on loneliness and mental health. But in undertaking this kind of organizing, people had to learn in practice how to use social media platforms like Facebook, WhatsApp, or Zoom as community organizers, and not simply as lay users. So they have to learn in action how to use all of this media in order to organize their activities. The emphasis on the commons, I think, also signals a possible move away from commercial social media platforms that are owned by private companies and that are not designed for political organizing. Of course, this is still very difficult to do, as the majority of people know and use mainstream social media platforms. However, civic education, I think, should familiarize people with a wide range of alternative platforms that are available for civic activity and that are often built on free software ideals. For example, you see here a screenshot from Lumio, a decision-making platform that allows people to take decisions in a participatory manner. This was created by some free software developers in New Zealand who were inspired by the movements of the squares. But the values of the commons and also of action mean that such digital media pedagogies should train citizens to be not only consumers of social media platforms, but also active creators by teaching them, for instance, programming skills. The idea of the commons also implies that citizens should be in charge of their personal interaction data. They may well decide to share some of this data in common to develop projects that benefit the wider community. But in any case, this data should not be the preserve of social media platforms. At the same time, the values of equality and the commons also valorize the knowledge produced by everyday citizens. It is not simply the experts who can teach others in a top-down manner, but knowledge can emerge out of the documentation of the movement's practices, for example. Through the documentation, people's action produces knowledge that can then be shared with others who would like to follow their example. For instance, in Nuit Debout, activists meticulously documented everything in a wiki site, an application that is extremely important for the collaborative production of knowledge. The Nuit Debout wiki that you see here was used to diffuse knowledge about how to organize your own Nuit Debout in your city. Finally, the care ethic of such democratic systems means that being caring of others on digital media platforms is part of our practice of being a good citizen. Caring online thus becomes a political issue. It is not just a social issue. This, for instance, may include avoiding trolling and framing wars, but it may also refer to ensuring that the rhythm and timing of communication does not lead to tiredness and burnout. It may mean knowing when to switch off. It is also learning how to manage one's emotions online so that we care both for ourselves and for the others. In sum, what I try to show is that there are different ways to consider social media pedagogies. One is to follow the mainstream debates that focus on proprietary social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and that tend to consider the citizen as a consumer. But there are pedagogies that are centered on a different understanding of democracy and citizenship, one that is based on action, equality, care, and the commons. These look at both mainstream social media platforms and alternative free software platforms. Such pedagogies also operate with a different logic, as they are more bottom-up, peer-to-peer, and open. I find that mainstream pedagogies, although necessary in order to resist the onslaught of disinformation on social media platforms, can go only some way in addressing the problem. Creative pedagogies, by contrast, address the roots of the problem. That is, if you agree with me, that the roots can be found in the limits of the current system of liberal representative democracy. In the end, our pedagogies, social media or otherwise, should conform to the ideals and values of democracy that we'd like to uphold. In this respect, I agree with the American philosopher John Dewey and his idea of creative democracy, which is why I also called it creative pedagogies. But I think that Dewey's view also is also very much in agreement with what I talk about when I talk about project democracy. So it is interesting, I think, that Dewey wrote about creative democracy in 1939 when he was seeing the rise of fascism in the world. For Dewey, creative democracy should be an antidote to authoritarianism. Democracy should be a way of life, practiced every day by people cooperating for the common good. As he noted, the democratic faith in human equality is belief that every human being, independent of the quantity and range of his personal endowment, has the right to equal opportunity with every other person for development of whatever gifts he has. This is what a creative or a project democracy would aim to develop. This is what I think our social media pedagogies should be aiming towards. I will stop here and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. And if you're interested in a copy of the slides or in the list of references, please feel free to email me or contact me on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. Seguiré en català.
Okay, switching to Catalan now. Well, you have... Can you hear me, Anastasia? You have touched on many topics, very important topics. And I would like to start with this issue of social movements, because in Barcelona, social movements have been very powerful. There was a municipalist proposal that is now in power, and it's the second term that Ada Colau's government is in the municipality. And it's that transition, that step from social movements or the organization of people beyond institutions and representation that end up in government institutions. So to what extent representative democracy, as you said, which today I'm not sure if we have the democratic faith that Dewey talked about. I don't know if we can maintain our democratic faith after the Second World War and all the authoritarianism that surrounds us. But this transition from self-organization or knowledge production, horizontal relations, if that fits in democratic institutions as they are designed today, because that's one of the major dilemmas that people are facing. Those people that were shouting on the squares, they do not represent us. This is a question for both of you, because you both have first-hand experience. Would you like to start, Simona? I don't know if I want to discuss this topic, because I came here to discuss pedagogy, but good evening, everyone, anyway. Does she understand Catalan, or she has a voice in her ear? Yes, she has interpretation. So good evening. I don't want to really dwell on this, because very interesting things have been brought up by Anastasia. And if we now start discussing how social movements have transitioned to the institutions, I feel that we're moving away from the topic. So, but I want to talk about democracy. I believe that social media, pedagogy, and democracy are three very interesting terms. Let me go back to what Anastasia said, the idea of learning by doing and the commons. And I would like to say that I always think that the idea of democracy that we've been taught has led us to make mistakes. They have made us believe that democracy means that we all agree, but democracy is the opposite. We know that we always disagree, starting with your partner, even with yourself sometimes. But of course, in pairs, it's very difficult. And the more we are, the more difficult it is to agree. So to try and think that democracy is to agree, everyone, I think that this has paved the way for authoritarianism. The fact that someone who knows best or is stronger will save us from disagreement. And I think that democracy is precisely the opposite. It's the ability to reach agreements by disagreeing. I believe, well, Anastasia's work focuses very much on that. And when we talk about social media, if we pause for a moment, internet, I mean, we talk about networks or media because the internet is a net. All of a sudden, that technology emerges in our life. Well, it's not all of a sudden, it happened 50 years ago, but anyway, it's a technology whose strength lies with being decentralized. The idea, the origin of internet is precisely to avoid centralized architectures or structures because they are weaker. Because if you reach the core and you kill the core, you can destroy the whole thing. Whereas in a decentralized network or distributed network, such as the internet, that is made up by nodes and information can go this way or that way or the other way, and it is repackaged and reconstituted elsewhere, allows for a distributed leadership, and it breaks with the dichotomy between authoritarianism, verticality, and horizontality, proletariat, dictatorship, which are not very consistent in human experience. And it proposes this notion of a network. So it basically says that democracy is not a uniform thing, and it's not something that is imposed top down, but a series of distributed commitments. And I think it is a solution. It contributes with a solution. I think that the digital era contributes with a solution to governance. And all of these topics that have been mentioned by Anastasia, this idea, this notion of the commons, how do we build those commons based on the idea of networking, based on the non-uniformity, based on personal and collective care with the same weight? And this idea, I mean, to me, the learning element and the learning by doing element is very important because the core of the network is sharing. Sharing not only as a value, but as a structural element. The network cannot work without the sharing element, without these transparent connections between the nodes that make up the network. So without connections and transparency in the communication with the rest of the network, ontologically, the network could not exist. So this idea of sharing, I mean, the first attacks against internet come from this idea that sharing is awful. Free culture says that sharing is good. And I think that in the presentation of this pedagogical freedom and claiming pedagogical freedom that we just heard, puts this sharing element at the center. The school is not a place where you go, you are given information, and then you are thrown out of the window and you fend for yourself. No, you learn from others, and you learn about this idea of democracy and about the commons. And I say this, well, to basically, well, going back to this idea of pedagogy, we learn at all times in life by sharing. Actually, learning means to copy and to reinterpret. I'm talking about all kinds of learning, maths, 2+2, or learning about others' thinkings, reading books. So this sharing notion is central. And today there are many tensions, precisely to do away with this huge opportunity that internet has brought about. There are many tensions to turn internet into a re-centralized place. So it's not distributed anymore, but it is occupied by big monopolies, by big institutional investments in this monopoly to basically do away with the possibility of sharing, learning, and working together for the commons. So that's my contribution to add to what Anastasia just shared, which has been very interesting because her research on social movements is very interesting, and it includes all of these aspects of governance and learning by sharing and working together. And I encourage you to read her. I didn't answer your question, but anyway, I can do it later if we've got time.
Anastasia, would you like to add something?
Well, it is no surprise that I agree with Simona, and I was making notes while she was speaking, but I agree with a lot of her with all of her points, really. And I think that decentralization is really important here, because decentralization, when you translate it into the issue of governance, it means that you need to have a governance system that deals with difference and deals with people who are in a minority. So instead of having a majority impose the rule of uniformity and everybody believing this exactly the same thing. But on the other hand, you do need some processes of centralization, like certain things, certain decisions need to be covering sort of like more of the community. And I think that this is the most difficult thing to manage, like where it is fine for people to diverge and which are the key values where people seem to need to be able to agree on. And normally these are values that are very vague and that are very broad in order to bring a lot of people in agreement. But I also think, and in order to not to answer your question, Paula, but to address it a little bit, that this is also the problem when a social movement enters into a process where it becomes government, right? Because it does need to try to facilitate this kind of agreement between like a lot of different positions and to govern, which throws up like a lot of problems, I find. So that translation is not always easy. But I think that these movements have provided us with some kinds of values, a kind of horizon that we need to be looking at whenever we are sort of like thinking about systems of democracy. And learning by doing is important here. And I think it's a very important value within more participatory systems. So it's not like in liberal democracy where, you know, there's a little bit this notion that the citizens should already be informed in order to be a good participant in politics, right? Here we have this idea that through participation, through action here, through doing, you start to learn, you start to become a better citizen, right? So in a way, the process of democracy itself is a pedagogical process. And I think that this is a very important value to keep in mind. And what I try to do in this talk is to actually argue that we shouldn't be thinking of democracy simply as a decision-making process. That I think democracy involves, it's much, much broader than that. And it involves projects that we often do not think of as part of democracy, either because these are jobs that normally women are doing, or minorities, or people, you know, sort of it's keeping the kitchens going, because in order for people to make decisions, they should be fed, right? So in thinking about democracy, I think that we should be taking a wider view about the kinds of activities that are necessary in order for the civic body to exist. And I use the term body because it goes back to the body, right? So there are physical needs as well. And I think sometimes that we do not really think about this as much. And taking a more feminist view, I think, is important here. So yes, this is what I had to say. And a final point, which comes out of my research, because I don't think I've mentioned that, but I've done about 100 interviews with Occupy activists, with other activists from the movements of the square. So a lot of these, what I shared with you today actually comes out from empirical work and from what people have told me. When we go back to this idea of decentralization, we need to think about the role of the leader here, right? So what leaders do is, in such systems, leaders tend to be the people who step up and take responsibility, because this is a system that is based on action. This was like, who's going to do that? I'm going to do that. I'm responsible. But these are people who should know when to step back as well and to give others the opportunity to become leaders. So leadership is very closely related with pedagogy again. A leader is not somebody who just rules. It's somebody who takes responsibility at a specific point in time, trains others in the role, and then steps back. So I think that what it means to be a good leader and a good political leader is also that. And I think it's very closely related to learning. So I'll stop here.
Bé, estem parlant sobretot d'aquestes potències.
We are talking about the potential of the network, the possibility of sharing. But I would like to talk about the propagation of the polarization and authoritarianism, because of course social media or the network at large promote authoritarianism. I think that Anastasia said something along the lines of ideas look acceptable, or specific ideas look acceptable, or are even accepted at some point in time. And this has resulted in a certain transgression. People are starting to leave the social media because of the violence exercised against public figures. They close their accounts because there is an impossibility of having a dialogue, because that space to have a dialogue is a dissent space, which should be the basis of any democracy, rather the absolute similarity, on the contrary, the possibility to be unique and different. But it looks as if social media look for uniformity in their propagation of authoritarianism and the same ideas. Yes, we have worked a lot on the MA on technopolitics and rights. We focused on this topic, and I'll go back to some ideas shared by Anastasia. And it has to do with your previous question, because all the paths of these problems of this information end up in the same place, which are political parties. Because that's the standard structure of a political party. Even some political parties that would like to get it right, they can't, because the way political parties are devised, well, they were thought out to occupy centralized spaces. In the past, the political parties basically filled up parliament, because we cannot all of us go to the parliament to take decisions, and we don't want that, because there's a distributed leadership. We're not talking about verticality and horizontality. It's much more complex. So you need to have trust in someone to go to the parliament to take a vote, a decision, and then tell you about it. But now with the social media, that is totally changed. You can see what is happening inside the parliament. You can take part in it. So the level of participation and engagement is much higher, very different. So political parties are not adapted to what is needed to function today. And once again, we have to talk about de-intermediation. Internet changes the roles played by some intermediaries that they used to play a role in the past. But now that we have this idea of networking, of transparency and interconnected nodes, their usefulness has changed. We don't need a political party to have millions of followers anymore. With 2 or 3 competent people that comply with the political program, that would be enough. But we're still dragging along old structures. But going back to this information, I don't think that propaganda is bigger today or more powerful. The problem today is that the intermediaries that used to decide what was news back in the past, today they have many more competitors. Because in the past, we were in bubbles, just the same. You could be a reader of the El País newspaper or the ABC newspaper, one left-wing and the other one right-wing, and you could have very different versions of reality. And if you didn't use any other tool to be informed, you would live in that bubble. Just like today's Facebook algorithms, you only see what you believe in. That's true, but it used to be the case in the past too. And psychologically speaking, we also have our confirmation bias, and we prefer to read on a daily basis something that we already believe, rather than checking what other media say that might challenge our beliefs. So, and I advocate that we don't have to contribute to the narrative that says that the internet has brought this problem about. We have a history of propaganda. In our book, we explain that the Troy horse, for example, is a great masterpiece of propaganda. We make the enemy believe that we are at peace, and the enemy is in the belly of the horse. It's a fake communication piece. So powers have always created their own narratives. In the First World War, the narrative was for people not to feel ashamed to go and die in the war. Well, you have to use a lot of propaganda so that people, millions of people, believe that. So our book reaches an empirical conclusion, which is the following. Of course, social media pose problems. Of course, there is a re-intermediation because Facebook, Twitter, and already back at the time of the 15M, we had conquered Facebook and Twitter, and they were tools that had been reused, and they had been used to break away from systemic mainstream information, and now they have gone back to the previous space, because of course when power sees that you are conquering a specific space, well, they try to swallow it up again and reconquer. And obviously this problem of disinformation has to do with power, with who is investing money. We also contribute with a solution, which is a specific labeling. All of the legislations mentioned by Anastasia are liberticide, as we say. All legislation proposals, you have them all listed in our book, they are liberticide because they ask the question in a place that is not correct for people, for the network, for the sharing, but it's just correct and adequate for the information monopoly that used to exist in the past. So the question is, why do people believe lies? Well, if people believe lies, and it's not my lies, government or media, no, other people's lies. So if people believe in things I don't want them to believe because they used to believe me and now they believe someone else, it means that they are misusing the freedom of speech. So all of these legislations are curtailing freedom of speech. So our question is the following. Freedom of speech can be good or bad, but it's a right and it needs to be advocated for and defended. And that's not the problem. Freedom of speech is not the problem, because otherwise we would be talking about the freedom of thinking. The confirmation bias is something that we have here at the back of our head, in our brains. It's a reptilian system. It's a self-defense system. So if we abandon that, we have a problem with control. But there's a much easier solution. Big investments which have changed the history of humanity. For example, the Capitol case, to talk about a recent case. There's always a lot of money behind that, a huge investment. Disinformation is a business or an institutional practice. So if we track the money, if we follow the money, and we make the big powers emerge and reveal them where they invest to conquer information, we will be surprised and we will find solutions and we will save freedom of speech and we will defend that the network and social media, the internet, allows us to choose much more or beyond the classical media or left-wing and right-wing and many more things, but let's change the turn here.
Vols afegir alguna cosa, Anastasia?
Would you like to add something, Anastasia?
I think, well, I agree with Simona, and I'm glad because I think she's saying certain things more directly that I alluded to in my presentation, but I wasn't sort of like very direct about it. But I do really agree with her that propaganda always existed and it's now done differently. And of course, we need to look at the implications of that and how to regulate better and all of that. But this is why I started talking about democracy. And I think I share in a way her frustration. And I'm not sure she's frustrated. I don't want to put sort of like words in her mouth. But I thought that, you know, we could do better things with the internet, that we could have a better kind of governance, that we could have a governance that perhaps is more decentralized, that allows much more participation. And I still cling on to that dream that it might be possible because the technologies are available. So this is why I think that, you know, the discussion should be political. It's not really about the media. And I think both Simona and me, in our way, are trying to sort of like shift the discussion there. Because I think if we talk about disinformation and the big platforms and political parties, we get stuck in this, for me, quite conservative framework of looking at this. And I think we need to introduce our own framework, which is why we started talking about decentralization and participation and all of these other values.
També és cert que necessitem en aquest sentit una pedagogia.
It's true that we need participatory pedagogy in our democracies too. We need to learn what it means to participate in a democracy or to be a citizen in a democracy. So in that sense, that participation, that engagement is not very much developed anywhere. If you allow me, I'd like to talk about tools now. And unfortunately, I would like to talk about a lack of action of political structures, because something that we're doing at XNet is to talk about democratic digitization. How are we digitizing? And of course, we work with educational centers, but as an example of a very serious situation that not only happens in schools, but throughout the administration and in our own governments, the way we operate digitally. We are now talking about political philosophy slightly, but before the political philosophy, we say, okay, we have the internet and we could improve the daily governance or the administration governance. Are we doing things properly for people to take part in the system, to contribute? I'm not talking about freedom of speech now, for everyone to voice their opinion. That goes without saying. But real participation, like I am knowledgeable about this and I can contribute to the governments, not on the squares or in revolutions, but on a daily basis to make my society grow. And at XNet, there's a group of parents that in 2019 came to us. I don't have children, I don't know that, but they told us 80% of digitization in schools is not being properly organized. And in the case of Catalonia and Spain, is being done by Google or Microsoft. But there's a huge gap, and this has been accelerated by the COVID to digitize. So I'm talking about schools now as an example. So they told us that digitization was being done by Google. So what's the problem with that? Well, many problems. That poses many problems. Well, Google is free. And the fact that we have institutions that believe that free means fine, and I don't ask me why, that's very dangerous. The fact that a big multinational company, they are not nuns or missionaries, it's a TNC. In Catalonia, we have 1 million pupils in public state schools. And the fact that this TNC can digitize for free 1 million users, well, we should wonder what is going on. And of course, talking about privacy, I don't want to elaborate on this, it's a long discussion, but I'm just mentioning that we are re-digitizing, or we are saying the internet destroys monopolies because it de-intermediates, but we should be careful that we do not go back to the same structure that we have overcome thanks to this new idea of a network. So instead of digitizing in a way that we tap into this potential of shared governance and network, we are allowing a big monopoly to do that. And I don't have a problem with Google. Google is a company and they are doing their job. It's a market and they do that very well. But as a society, we have to think about this in schools and at the administration, whether this is the way we want to go. And to wrap up, there's another element, which is the thinking. I have specialized in recent years in this because we are now creating an alternative prototype that has a pilot in Barcelona, thanks to the Barcelona municipality. And that is helping set up a new alternative because there is no such thing. I think that at the beginning of June, we'll launch the tool and it will be very exciting. But now, on top of this layer, there's another one that has to do with how we teach digital. I always say that we always teach like the binder and the exorcist. Let's say that internet is a technology and the printing press is another technology. The printing press has created books. But what if Catalan lessons or literature lessons were delivered by a binder? And that's interesting, why not? Of course, you need to bind the book properly, and then an exorcist to tell you that books are dangerous and careful with everything that is printed because it's evil. And then they leave and we move on with literature content. That's the way we are teaching digital tools today in schools. There's a technical guy, a technical teacher, and a police officer. And we have a problem because maybe we don't need to know everything about the technical side of the internet, just like you don't really need to know how a book is bound. But we need this to be channeled properly, adequate to the times, to the era that we are living in, which is an era of exchange, of new forms. Internet is faster than reading. Is that good or bad? I don't know. It's different and it's as interesting. And there are specific things about internet, and we need to understand digitization from a humanistic standpoint. We should not all become technical people because maybe we are very good at other things. So About technophobia, there's an oscillation between technophobia, internet is dangerous, it only brings monsters about, and technosolutionism. With Google, sorry, Google, it's just an example because you account for 80% of the digitization of our pupils. But people believe that with Google, the digitization is achieved and that's it. And that is shaping a very fragile citizenship. Of course, you will never be fully knowledgeable about the technical side, and you will always feel an underdog in a way. And we can all understand the bright sides and the positive sides of the digital world. And on the other side, once we feel weak, they tell us, oh, but there are these guys that are so knowledgeable and experts, and they send us to the hack of this monopoly of this TNC, and we do away with the empowerment and the redistribution of the government among citizens.
Anastasia,
What's your take on this, Anastasia?
I mean, I agree. I agree with Simona. I don't think that everybody should become a techie or a programmer, but I think, in a way, feeling less afraid and knowing a little bit more about how the backstage works, and not for people to do it necessarily, will help people to feel less alienated by these technologies. Like it is, I think it is easier for people to say, oh, leave digitization to Google, or leave this to Google, the big companies who know what they're doing, right? Or I cannot really comment on regulation or whatever it is because I don't know how they work. So I think it is important for citizens to have like a basic knowledge of how some of these systems work, not a very in-depth knowledge, a techie knowledge. They don't need to become techies, but I think it's part, in a way, of the empowerment, right? Not how the book is bound, but what a book is really. I think it's important for them to know.
No, I absolutely agree. I just think we miss one part. Because we are worried about the technique, we are worried about the danger, and then we miss a big chunk, which is the humanity, the humanism of the. So I agree with you. Of course, we need to know how the machine works. Of course, also. Yes.
Yes, true. And I completely agree with you with regards to technosolutionism, right? So for instance, all of these applications right now that can detect the artificial intelligence that can detect disinformation, and that is going to save us. And I think this is an important tool, but it doesn't really solve the need of people for disinformation. That there are certain people who like the fake news stories because it confirms their biases, it confirms their anger towards certain politicians or certain people, right? So technosolutionism can take us only so far. And with regards to the other thing that Simona said, like, to Google and to these big corporations that are digitizing knowledge, I think we have some interesting developments right now with the vaccine, right? So the US came out and said that the patent for the vaccine should not be held by companies, right? So perhaps the pandemic might be changing, or it provides an opportunity to actually enter the debate against certain kinds of patents and all of that, and in order to free up knowledge and to share it much more widely. Because I think that, okay, so I took you through some of the legislation around online harms and, the problems with freedom of speech and all of that. But I think with these companies, perhaps the greatest threat would be legislation that is antitrust legislation against monopoly. And this is where we would see the real sort of like battle happening. I'm not sure if we will see it with the current legislation that is being passed.
I agree with this. Yeah.
Deixeu-me obrir una mica el torn de preguntes.
Should we open up the Q&A session so that people in the room have the possibility to ask questions? Is there any questions from the audience or any question online? You can also post your questions on the chat box of the streaming page.
Cap pregunta?
No questions?
Allà tenim una pregunta.
Oh, there's a question there.
Hi, Anastasia. Thank you very much for your words. When you were talking about this creative pedagogies, I'm left with some doubts in regards of the kinds of pedagogy. In the chart you left, it said mainstream pedagogy is top down from experts to citizens, and the creative pedagogies talked about bottom up, peer to peer. But my preoccupation would be in this context of post-truth, of misinformation, of fake news, encouraging or working towards this kind of pedagogies. I fail to completely see where is the balance between using ¿cómo se dice? Between giving the power to people who don't know, but because basically generally people don't know, and really democratizing knowledge and pedagogies. So it rings a little anarchist to me, but I don't know what you might think about this. The power given to the people and the power of the experts between horizontal and vertical, you know? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this question. And I think this is why I also said that, it is important to think of both together, right? So that we have the more sort of like mainstream pedagogy, which is important when it comes to disinformation and social media. Sort of like we need experts. Like I position myself as an expert, so but on the other hand, we need this kind of sort of like more open and peer-to-peer pedagogy, and we need to create processes where people learn from each other. And I think that this is really important because it is a democratic process. Now, how do people learn? If people learn by doing, if people learn through participation, they also create sort of like knowledge through their participation in politics. So here I'm not saying that we don't have expertise and we don't have experts, but we don't have just a top-down process with the expert imparts knowledge. We have a process where we're training people to be experts themselves, right, through participation. And when it comes to, I think, participation in a democracy, if we expand our notion of democracy, people do have a lot of skills that they don't think are necessary or even valuable, but they are extremely important in the democratic system. So, and I think these movements show that, like, you may not be very knowledgeable about certain political issues, but you know how to cook. And this is your entry point in the movement, right? You cook for people. But through the cooking and through how the sort of like kitchen team is organized and how it's taking decisions about what to cook and about who to cook for and about how, we should be taking democratic decisions when organizing the kitchen, you become much more knowledgeable around the political process. So this is what I mean with the openness and with the learning by doing. And I think it is also valuing a wider range of skills that I think we don't tend to value when we talk about democracy. And I think these tend to be skills of people who are lower class or who are women and which are not really valued as much. Like we value information and these kinds of cognitive skills, but not other skills. But going back to the beginning, when it comes to disinformation, like of course I think we need expertise. I'm not arguing against expertise, but I'm also arguing for a more participatory process through which experts impart their knowledge and also teach other people how to become experts as well. Do not hold on to the power of their expertise. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Més preguntes?
More questions?
Hola, bona tarda i moltes gràcies.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much, Anastasia, for your presentation. I want to thank also Simona, and I had her name somewhere, Paula. Paula, thank you. Thank you for your contributions. I agree with most of the points, but I have one last doubt. I think that technological platforms open up the possibility for citizens to participate more, but I think that we have a problem regarding participation culture. And Anastasia, I would like to ask you about this. How can we promote that? Or is there a different paradigm between Spain and the UK? In my experience here in Spain, from the school, from school age, and we're talking about learning by doing, I think that we are still taught in a unidirectional manner. So the teacher transfers knowledge to the pupils, and that is then reflected in many different areas of our society. Many people believe that's democracy. You vote once every 4 years, and that's about it. Or now we are in a Q&A session and there's silence in the room. So how can we promote the participation culture? And I don't know if in the UK the situation is different. Maybe you can tell us about it. Thank you.
I don't know whether Simona would also like to come into that to talk about Spain. I don't think it's much different in the UK in terms of how pupils learn at school. We try to do it a little bit differently at university, where we have more workshops and, you know, sort of like students working on this, and more seminars and discussions where sort of like encourage people to talk. But I think that still we are in this, as you say, very top-down pedagogy, right? And a person we haven't really mentioned here is Paulo Freire's ideas, and his ideas around the pedagogy of the oppressed, which I think is very, very relevant to what we've been talking about here. I mentioned Dewey, who was very, who had, I think, quite similar ideas, but I think Paulo Freire is also a touch point here. And I think your question is extremely interesting, because it seems to me that to be a little bit of a chicken and an egg question. How do you make things more participatory with more participation? So if there is no participation, we have this kind of vicious circle where people do not think that it is worth participating. Like, why participate in a consultation? Why participate in a process if you do not really think that your ideas will be taken seriously? And this is where I think those movements were interesting, at least in the beginning, because people would go to the square or would go online, they would feel that they were being heard, that their participation mattered. Now, if you don't feel that your participation matters, then you're not going to participate, which is, you know, absolutely normal. So in a way, to teach people to participate, we need to be able to create more participatory systems. And we need to make participation matter in the system and for people as well. But I do acknowledge that this is a little bit of a chicken and an egg question answer, and I'm sorry for that, but you know, I cannot see any other way. That we need to demand more participation, and participation that matters in our political systems.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think the idea of participation was very strong in the 15M, Indignados, all this period, very, very strong. And then the system grabbed it, and now everything is proceso participativo. Oh, I'm speaking in English, I think. Yes, let's switch to Catalan. Y ahora todo es proceso participativo.
And now everything is a participatory process, but there's a lot of confusion, as Anastasia just said. We mistake I mean, you can say if you want the tram to be green or yellow, and then they will do anything after you have voiced your opinion, and we do not participate because we are being offered. Well, the institutions misunderstood this. They offer us to speak freely, which, okay, we're grateful for that, but that's not a participatory process because there needs to be responsibility and powers and budget, etc. And once again, just like with fake news, a lot is being demanded from citizens, but the first person in charge is the one at the institution. That's why they have a salary. And it's the same here. People say that people do not participate, but why don't we start proposing consistent participatory processes? And then people will participate, truly. We have the testimony of people back in Porto Alegre with the first participatory budgeting processes, or in the Basque Country. They were the first ones to include an email address of the institutions to contact the institution. That was many years back. And they explained, both in Brazil and the Basque Country, that in the first 6 months, they were only insulted online through email. Because as Isaac Asimov says, since agriculture was invented, and hierarchy and the boss and the workers, so 5 millennia, we haven't trained or exercised our participation. And we do not train in participation if it's worthless, because we're busy enough. And people in Porto Alegre explained that they were expelled with stones. So I am paying your public salary and you want me to create the budget. So later, this has started to be understood. And for some time, the participatory budgeting processes in Porto Alegre were very important. But again, then the system grabbed it. And between egg and chicken, I always say chicken. I always tend to place responsibility on powers, on the power side, because then people get familiarized with things. More questions? Anyone else? Remarks, observations, reflections? Okay, so thank you very much, Anastasia. It's been a very interesting session. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and we will keep thinking and trying to do, increasingly so, opening up new participatory spaces. Thank you, Simona, for your reflections. You're at hand. You're closer here. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Ciao,
Bye-bye.
Anastasia. See you soon.
Ciao.